and welcome to House of Sharing, residence and museum for victims of Japanese military sexual slavery during World War II. Originally founded in 1992 in Haewadong, Seoul, South Korea, the residence is now located in Gwangju City, about 40 minutes outside of Seoul, nestled in a quiet retirement village. Before we begin our tour of the museum, let me give you a little introduction to the grounds. In the office, we have the House of Sharing Management, the Korean and Japanese researchers, and other staff. Here, the House of Sharing team works to care for the needs of the residing victims, develop the museum, research, and handle questions from and lead tours for visitors. This newly built residence currently houses 8 of the elderly. Each woman has her own room, and there are common spaces such as the living room and dining room, where the residents and public may congregate. On the second floor is a kitchen with a dining hall and an outside sitting area. The Rotunda building was donated by the Buddhist Human Rights Committee, which also donated the land on which the House of Sharing sits. This building serves as a space for showing videos, having discussions or presentations, and hosting guests. The second floor also has the purpose of serving as a ceremonial space for the residing monk to perform rituals when a resident passes away. The museum that we will now tour is the only museum in the world dedicated to sexual slavery and serves as the cornerstone of research on Japanese military sexual slavery during World War II. The statue behind me represents the hopes and dreams that the grandmothers had as young women. What you see is a very robust and healthy woman with her arms out. There's a crown above her head, symbolizing some kind of regality or abundance. The man on the horse above her right shoulder symbolizes a husband, riding by horse to his bride's family home, as was the tradition during marriage ceremonies in Korea in the early 1900s. Over her left shoulder is a family portrait, with healthy children, a husband, and grandparents. While this may seem to the modern viewer like a very patriarchic understanding of happiness, this was indeed what the women hoped for their lives at that socio-historic moment. And behind me we have the bronze statue that represents what actually happened to these women. The woman in this depiction is experiencing the opposite of what her dreams had been. Her body is pierced by bayonets, representing the violence that has occurred to her. Even her hanbok, the traditional Korean dress, has been pierced and torn. Out of her right hand, the Korean national flower falls, symbolizing the loss of national identity. Out of her left hand falls a dove, symbolizing the loss of peace. It is only fitting that we enter the museum with this quote, spoken by Kim Hak-soon, who was the first comfort woman to come out publicly in 1991, and whose hands are here folded. The quote, roughly translated, says, "We must record these things that were forced upon us." This summarizes the main purpose driving the activism at House of Sharing, and offers a universal message about the importance of history and truth-telling. With this message, we enter the museum, recognizing the need to restore justice to the former victims of Japanese military sexual slavery from World War II. Let's begin with the history. Most of us in the West already know a lot about the European side of World War II. However, not many of us are educated about the Asian perspective on World War II and what was happening over here in East Asia at that time. In the early 1930s, Japan was already in the process of its attempt to colonize the entirety of East and Southeast Asia. In the early 1930s, Korea was already an annex of Japan. And we must remember that Korea at that time was North and South Korea unified. Therefore, Korea as an annex of Japan was being used as a base off of which the Japanese military could move into China and the rest of East and Southeast Asia. It was as a result of the Nanjing Massacre in 1937 that the large-scale trafficking of women into comfort stations began. When Japanese soldiers took over the city of Nanjing, China, they also raped and murdered many of the female residents. This infuriated the local population, causing a significant retaliation that ended up in a massacre of the people of Nanjing. The Japanese military government thus decided that in order to better control its soldiers and in order to stop the spread of disease and unwanted pregnancy, that it would set up a system of brothels where the Japanese soldiers could be serviced. If we take a look at the map, we can see all the triangles, squares, and circles across East and Southeast Asia where there were brothels set up. The red circles indicate places where the official documents by the UN and other organizations have confirmed that there were comfort stations. The triangles represent places where former comfort women have testified that they were placed. And then the squares represent places where former soldiers or local people have testified there having been comfort stations. What we can see on this map is that the comfort stations were spread all across East and Southeast Asia. Now, this isn't surprising because there were Japanese soldiers all across this area. However, what is surprising is that more than 70% of these comfort stations were filled with Korean sex slaves. Now, the reasons why more than 70% of the women taken into the brothels were Korean women is something that we're going to discuss in just a moment. But first, I'd like to point out that the only way Korean women in the early 1930s could get from Korea to the rest of East and Southeast Asia would have been by Japanese military transport. It is important to note that not all of the women taken into the system of sexual slavery were Korean women. Japanese women, Filipino women, Dutch women, women from any country where the Japanese were stationed were used in the system of sexual slavery. However, it is true that the vast majority of the more than 200,000 women taken into the system of Japanese military sexual slavery were Korean, and there are a number of reasons why this is. The first reason is political. As we already mentioned, Korea was an annex of Japan in the early 1930s. Therefore, the Japanese military government had complete control over the Korean people, and it had complete access to the Korean women. The second reason is economic. During the Japanese colonial occupation, Korea was extremely impoverished. This meant that people were not educated and did not even have enough money to eat. This put the community at odds with each other and put people in very desperate situations. And of course, there were the socio-cultural aspects. Korea was an extremely patriarchal society at this time in its history. Women were viewed not only as less than men, but as property of men. Women were viewed as property of their fathers first, and then property of their brothers. Therefore, they were sold between fathers and husbands, or between families and servants as property. They had monetary value beyond that of just a dowry. All of these factors made it fairly simple for the Japanese military to take the Korean women into their system, either by force or by deception. Although there were women who were taken off the street forcibly or taken from their homes forcibly, most of the women were deceived into believing that they were actually taking a job. The Japanese military had set up fake jobs that were advertised to families that women could come and work as nurses, as laborers, as farm workers, as factory workers, in exchange for a certain amount of money that would be sent back to the families. However, the women never ended up in those jobs. They ended up in brothels. There are a number of characteristics that the women taken into the system of sexual slavery had in common. They were uneducated, they were impoverished, and they were young. However, for the Korean victims, they were particularly young, between the ages of 13 and 19, and there was a cultural reason for this. In East Asia, there's an extreme respect for the institution of marriage, so married women, for the most part, were not taken into this system. Comfort stations were set up wherever there were Japanese soldiers. The military used whatever buildings were available, ranging from residential homes to commercial buildings. For soldiers on the front lines, they sent women in the back of trucks that would move where the soldiers went. Although the buildings used as comfort stations differed, there was a general layout attempted, as modeled in the architectural plan. As many rooms as possible were lined up in rows, with a hallway for the soldiers to walk through. There was often a waiting area for lineups, an office for the landlord and soldier assigned to guard the station, and an area for medical examination. There were a number of similarities between the comfort stations found across the Asian continent. Primarily were the signs and name blocks found on the interior walls of the stations. There was a list of prices written in Japanese. There were also rules posted in Japanese, the wording of which was almost identical in the various stations, indicating administration by the Japanese military government. The rules, such as don't beat the women, use the condom, and don't overstay your time, were posted, although they were not well enforced. Then there were the name blocks, on which each victim's Japanese name, which was used to identify them once taken into slavery, was written. The blocks were kept on the wall. If the side of the block with the name faced up, the woman was available. If the blank dark side was showing, then the woman was either already servicing a soldier or was ill. This is a model of what a comfort station room looked like. In actuality, it is about twice the size of the real rooms, but the setting is very accurate. The rooms were bare, dark, and crowded. There would usually be a sort of cot, a water basin, and often a broom for cleaning. The victims spent most of their time isolated in their rooms. Their daily routines started in the early morning, around 5 or 6 a.m., when they would prepare for their first soldier. The procedure was structured. The woman would wash herself, wash the condom, put the condom on the soldier, service the soldier, take off and wash the condom, wash herself, and start again with the next person. The woman serviced an average of between 20 and 30 soldiers per day. They were beaten, raped, and verbally abused daily. Punishments for escape attempts or for resisting soldiers were unspeakably cruel. The cruelty continued with regular medical examinations by Japanese military doctors, who often examined the women in front of the soldiers, sometimes raping them afterwards. The medical records displayed here were found in the military archives and prove that the Japanese military took responsibility for the health of the victims. The doctor recorded the women's Japanese names, their age, whether they were diseased or not, and whether they were on their menstrual cycle. Those who caught diseases were shot with mercury 606, which not only killed disease but damaged the women's bodies permanently. Those who were found pregnant often underwent cruel forms of forced abortion. Protection from disease and pregnancy was supposed to come in the form of condoms, but as women were forced to use condoms repeatedly, and the soldiers didn't always use them, the spread of disease did not decrease with the development of the comfort stations. Even if the condoms were used, as you can see, they were not likely effective. In this area, we talk about what we call the sadness of liberation. In the years of 1944 and 1945, when Allied forces moved in and the Japanese military fled, there were scenes of chaos and confusion for everyone, and particularly for the comfort women. Those who weren't murdered by the soldiers in order to disguise evidence of the comfort stations were left to fend for themselves. Penniless, left in a foreign land with a foreign language, uneducated, and often alone, the women had few options to survive. Some of them ended up in the sex industry, some became servants in homes, some married, although few were physically able to have children, and some died. Very few ever returned to their homeland. The stories are varied, but they all had in common that the rest of their lives, dictated by trauma, suffering, and silence, would be shaped by their years in the comfort stations. Ironically, Haksun Kim breaking her silence in 1991 deepened the silence of the Japanese government. As soon as the issue became public as a result of protestations of former victims, findings by Japanese researchers, and the efforts of multiple nonprofit organizations, the Japanese government took measures to silence the issue. They began systematically destroying related evidence in the military archives. They took out any mention of the issue in history textbooks, and they strongly encouraged teachers to not teach about it in class. What little information was out there about the comfort stations and its victims was now censored and removed from the records. These books and newspaper clippings are what remain. Prior to Haksun Kim's public declaration in 1991, the Korean Council for the Women drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan had already been established, and research on the issue by the Council was underway. In 1990, the Korean Council filed suit and demanded compensation for the victims which they lost. In December of 1991, the Korean Comfort Women Issue Countermeasure Committee issued a statement in support of the victims. The registration of more than 200 victims from 1991 onwards drew the attention of other organizations, including the United Nations, and international support for the victims has been continuously building. In 1998, Gay McDougall, Special Rapporteur to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, published the report Contemporary Forms of Slavery, which detailed the severe violations of the human rights of the women victims on the part of the Japanese military during World War II. In 1997, the United States House of Representatives, the Dutch Parliament, the Canadian House of Commons, the European Parliament in Strasbourg, and the Foreign Affairs Committee of the UK Parliament all passed resolutions demanding that Japan make an official apology and compensate the victims. All of the resolutions were non-binding, however, and unable to proffer an apology from Japan. In fact, still to this day, the Japanese government refuses to acknowledge its past and make an official apology to the victims. Up until the 1990s, the government refused to acknowledge that it had had any role in the systematic establishment of the comfort stations. Since the early 1990s, there have been vague and non-binding apologies meant to quell public opposition, while at the same time denying legal liability for the crimes. In 1995, in yet another failed attempt to silence the victims, Japan set up what is known as the Asian Women's Fund, which gathered private funds in order to compensate the victims. This only further enraged the victims and activists, however, as using private funds to compensate the victims was just another means of avoiding state responsibility. Even today, Japan's prime ministers refuse to offer the apology and meet the demands of the victims. Since Haksun Kim's public outing, women all over the world have come out as former victims of Japanese military sexual slavery during World War II. These brave women stand in solidarity with their Korean counterparts and work with organizations in their own regions to bring justice to female victims of sexual violence and wartime sexual slavery everywhere. Their efforts represent the victims of all nations who are still silenced, or who never had the chance to speak out because they didn't survive. There's also a lot of activism in the public, especially in Japan, where a number of groups have formed to resolve the issue. In fact, at the House of Sharing, the majority of visitors are Japanese, more than either Korean or international visitors. Some of the most vivid memories of the victims are captured in these paintings, which were done with the help of an art therapist in the mid-1990s. In these paintings, the grandmothers were able to express their innermost suffering. Despite the fact that the Japanese government has yet to give an official apology, these brave women have been a model for survivors all over the world, and an example of the power of victim-led initiatives for justice and truth. At House of Sharing, the residents here live as activists, allowing their personal lives to be on public display for the sake of correcting history and preventing other women from suffering the same fate. They receive visitors daily, giving testimonies about their experiences as sex slaves and answering questions from the public and media. In addition, the survivors attend weekly demonstrations put on by the Korean Council for Women drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan. The demonstrations have been held every single week since January 8, 1992, in front of the Japanese embassy, and will continue until the demands of the victims are met.